Well, that was embarrassing, and realistically, I'm just a human being. So thank you, New South Wales DTA, for having me again. I was here 2 years ago, and I think the room was much smaller. So despite what was just said in your AGM, I feel like you've expanded, which is great to see. Can I just get an indication of who's a driver trainer in the room? So most people are. So I'm doing a presentation today and tomorrow. Today's presentation is very much geared towards driver trainers, and I hope I can help you a little bit immediately by translating what I have learnt around driving test anxiety. And I'm sure you see this quite often because it is common for young people in particular to suffer from driving test anxiety, specifically even if they don't have any diagnosed anxiety problems in their life. So yes, driving test anxiety, what can we do to help calm the nerves? So as a good researcher, I'm going to give you all the background to what I did first before we look at the solution. And just so I don't get you too excited, the solution is still growing, but I'm going to give you the research from Italy where the program has been developed and what we're going to adapt to Australian driving instructors. I know this is being done today already, so I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of where I conduct research up in Brisbane, Queensland, so the Turrbal and Yugara peoples. I'm sure this is not new to most of you, but maybe there are some things in this that you haven't heard before. But licensing for young people is more than just an ability to move around. So when a learner driver is at the typical age, so 16 to 17 years old in New South Wales, 16, yes, they're also going through a developmental stage where they're trying to form an identity and come through as an adult. So they're looking for autonomy, they're looking for different opportunities, and having a license also gives them access to things that allow them to develop that identity. So for some, it's about continued education. Some is for employment. For other people, it might be a lot of First Nations people need to help their communities, social services, health, whatever is crucial to that young person. A license enables them to become an adult in this real world. So the driving test is the first milestone that they need to go through to be able to become an independent driver. Driving test is supposed to determine if someone is competent and safe enough to be driving on our roads independently, given the restrictions that we have in place with graduated licensing. Now, I want you all to speak up here because this is what's written on paper, and I would really like to hear from you what's missing or what doesn't happen. So the driving test is supposed to assess speed management, road positioning, decision making, responding to hazards and vehicle control. Not yet? No. Yep. Anyone else?
Yeah, what's missing?
Yeah.
What it currently does or what should be it?
Either.
It doesn't assess independent driving.
Nice. Anyone else? No? Okay, that's enough for the moment. Let's move on. So the data tells us Australia-wide that 30% of Australian learner drivers fail the test on their first attempt. Some of the reasons, again, speak up if you experience something different. So they typically fail due to a lack of driving practice. So yes, they may have the hours, but are they actually practicing in a diversity of situations? Their manoeuvring errors, their speed choice, observation and awareness issues, and test anxiety. So does anyone else have any other things that they come across as to why?
Listening to their parents.
No.
All the boys fail on Friday.
Interesting.
That's the other thing.
Yeah. Okay, next one. So test anxiety, has anyone here not experienced test anxiety? So not experienced it at school? Are you someone unique that, no, great. So you know what I talk about when I say what test anxiety is. So this is just defining it in general. So that it's an experience of apprehension, it's about feeling nervous, and the symptoms that we generally see when someone is experiencing anxiety are both cognitive, so it's like how you're thinking, and then physical symptoms as well. So you might have an increased heart rate, you might have sweaty palms, some people might fidget. And this can happen either prior to the test or during the test. And prior to the test doesn't mean just before the test, it can be months and building up. Yeah, getting some nods. Yeah, it builds up and up and up. And then importantly, so this is just test anxiety in general, it impacts decision making, attentional control, and the self-regulatory capabilities, which I'm sure you can all identify as really important skills in driving. So therefore, test anxiety means that when someone's experiencing this, they're not at their optimal performance. So why wouldn't we expect them to maybe not do so well on their driving test? So the question that we wanted to ask is, does test anxiety contribute to increased driving errors and possible test failure? Yeah, so I think it's a given that you would all expect this to happen, but surprisingly there's very limited research that looks specifically at driving test anxiety, and the problem is when we don't have that background knowledge, it's very difficult to go on and develop solutions to the problem. So we need this information first, which we have now done, then we can move on to solving the problem. So we haven't analysed all the data that we collected in this study, and I must acknowledge my honours student who did this data analysis that I'm going to present to you today. Don't worry, I'm not giving you all the stats and the research stuff. But she was looking at understanding how test anxiety influences driving test performance, and particularly how trait and state anxiety are associated with the driving test errors. So I'm going to explain to you the difference between those two. So trait anxiety, so if you think of this as a personality trait, so these are people who have a tendency, potentially every day, to feel some sort of anxiety in some situations. And then state anxiety is something that's triggered by a particular situation, like a test, that's a temporary increase in anxiety. So the study we were looking at, we weren't looking at people that are being diagnosed with severe anxiety. This is just about experiencing this state anxiety in regards to the driving test. So the method, this is the kind of what we did, basically. So we only had 133 participants. 81% of those were female. So yes, unfortunately, when we do surveys, it's often overrepresented with young females. We were asking provisionally licensed drivers because we wanted to be assured that they had experienced the test. So we know that we were missing in our sample a lot of people that had failed and not gone through to succeed on the test. We looked at people aged 17 to 27 years because we were asking people retrospectively about their experiences of the test up to 3 years prior. Lucky for us, so we did the study in 2023, we did get 44% of those people who had done the test, whether it was their first or their second, in 2023, so same year of the study, and then 27% in 2022, and then the rest in 2021. So the people that were in our sample, on average, had taken the test once or twice. So they weren't necessarily people that have continual failures on the test. And the average number of errors that the participants had was 2. And most of these, you might not be surprised considering the female population of this sample, were about being too cautious in their approach to the test. This is just a little bit of evidence as to why we were able to look at 3 years prior and their experiences around anxiety in the test. So we know that when someone is emotionally aroused, their long-term memory is consolidated and it allows them to recall memories. So we decided that that would satisfy us to look at people and their experiences around test anxiety 3 years prior. This says measures, but the reason I wanted to show you this slide is to explain to you what we specifically looked at in regards to state anxiety. So remember I said the symptoms for anxiety can be cognitive or physical. So we measured state anxiety on these 5 dimensions. So we looked at social concerns, so about whether or not the young person had concerns that if they failed, they would be looked down on by friends and family. We looked at cognitive interference, so whether someone was having negative thoughts during the test that interfered with their ability to concentrate. We looked at worry, so worry was about worried to fail the test, and that was prior to and during the test. The physiological hyperarousal, so that's your heart palpitations and sweating, that type of thing. And then task irrelevant behaviours where like you're fidgeting or engaging in some other behaviour that distracts you from performance on the test. Trait anxiety, that just means we used a standard measure to assess as trait anxiety. And then we, of course, asked about their age, gender, and then the number and type of errors that they made on the test. Interesting things. So surprisingly, or maybe not, many participants reported that they have trait anxiety. So that means that sometimes on a daily basis, they have some symptoms of anxiety. With the state anxiety dimensions, so worry, so that fear of failing the test before and during, had the highest score for our participants. The physiological hyperarousal, task irrelevant behaviours, social concerns were all around average. Some of them had some of these. And then cognitive interference had the lowest. So that's where you have those negative thoughts impacting your performance during the test. So then we did some fancy statistical tests. And the first one we looked at is what was associated with the number of driving test errors. And we found that the worry, cognitive interference, physiological hyperarousal, task irrelevant behaviours were all associated with a higher number of test errors. But social concerns didn't come into play, which was interesting. And the very interesting one was that trait anxiety, even though it's associated with the state anxiety, was not associated with a higher number of errors on the test. And then we did another more complicated statistical test to get into the more details of what was actually going on. And it came down to these 2, so worry and cognitive interference that were predicting more errors on the test. So these are the cognitive, so the thinking, rather than the physical aspects of anxiety. So this is actually in line with other research that looks at test anxiety, not in regards to driving, that says that these cognitive components are actually the ones that impact a decline in performance. So basically what this means, so yes, driving test anxiety negatively impacts performance on the practical driving test, as I'm sure you all expected. And to me, this supports the notion that the driving test is not accurately measuring how competent or safe a driver is, but we continue to use it. So what we want to aim to do ultimately is to move towards a more equitable licensing and testing system. So yes, we need an innovative upgrade to make sure it is equitable and reliable of both safe and competent drivers. And then what's next? So it's about developing what I can do from my end is to develop a program for instructors to address anxiety, test anxiety. So my colleague in Italy, Paolo, has already developed a program, but we understood that what happens in Italy probably may slightly differ to what happens in Australia. So we needed to investigate what were the key things happening around test anxiety for Australian young learner drivers going for their test. But Paolo did introduce this, he delivered it, and he also tested it to see if it worked or not. So the aim of his program is to reduce anxiety, increase psychological wellness, and then to optimise driving performance. It's a 2 to 3 hour program. We would like to tailor it into something a little bit shorter than that. It involves 9 activities, and it incorporates a lot of psychological techniques. So I'm introducing not all of them. So for anyone that can count, there are not 9 there are only 7. But I wanted to present, I guess, some more relevant ones that may be applicable to Australia, but also highlight where we can tailor the training back, because from our findings found it's more the cognitive issues that our young drivers are experiencing. So therefore, that's what we should focus on. So different things that you can do. So there's narrative technique. So this is about talking to your young learner driver about the test and show them how they have personal control over what's going on during that test. Experience recall. So this is about thinking about success to increase their self-efficacy. So get them to believe that they can actually do this. Sorry, I'm only giving you an overview of what Paolo has developed, because as I said, we need to tailor it and adapt it. Visual imagery. So thinking about being in that test situation and being successful in their driving manoeuvres. Informative speech, so this is providing them with information about what's happening for them when they have performance anxiety. Self-talk, so how can they control and manage their thoughts both prior to and during the test. Humour, so introducing a short video. This is one of those things where I'm pretty sure that what they showed in Italy won't translate to Australian humour. And relaxation, so this is about regulating breathing and physiological activation, which, because we've found that it's the cognitive and the thinking aspects that are more important, the relaxation techniques may not be relevant to us here in Australia. And then what Paolo found, so he looked at 28 participants, so he had half of those go through the training and then half not, so that he can compare the differences. And there was a significant reduction in anxiety as soon as the people had been through the program. And those people also had a lower anxiety on the day of the test. But statistically speaking, it wasn't a significant difference. But to me, that doesn't matter. There was a difference. And I forgot my last point. And then the last point was that lower anxiety was associated with passing the test, which I'm all sure that you would have realised that anyway. Yeah, so that's the end of today's presentation. So if you've got any questions. So I think it's more getting them to, I guess, develop their self-efficacy, so their belief in the fact that they have control over their behaviour during the test, and get them to visualise themselves having positive behaviours during the test. So I think it's, from our findings, it's more about what they're thinking that's interfering with their performance, as opposed to any of the other interfering things like the jittery behaviours, sweaty palms, that type of thing. That didn't seem to be as important. And definitely didn't seem to be important that they cared about what their peers or family think. Yes?
You mentioned it was like a 2 to 3 hours. I know you said you probably present a little bit more than that, but is the intention here for this to be something... Is the intention for this to be something that maybe learner drivers would be enrolling in themselves, online, or whatever it is, leading up to the driving test? Or is it something that maybe as driving instructors we'd also be able to do with them? Or what's the intention there?
So my big goal in life is to upskill driving instructors. So I would like to initially see it something rolled out to upskill, like a professional development for driving instructors, and for you to take those skills and then teach the learner drivers. I think if we provided it directly to learners, it may not sit with them well. They may not have a good understanding of how to do it. Whereas I feel if we use people like you in this room, we'll probably be more successful. Yeah.
Two mics. The other question was, I'm very interested in your thoughts then as to the evolution of the driving test, because for years and years and years I've advocated that it needs to be changed massively. So I would really like to hear your thoughts. You were talking about a more efficient test that, or effective test that actually does measure that somebody is safe to be out there on their own.
So I'm going to be very controversial because I know there's some people that don't agree with this. And there are good ways to go about this and not so good ways. And I think we have good examples and bad examples in Australia. But competency-based testing, I believe, is the way to go, rather than measuring people in a, I don't know what it is here, but half an hour to 45 minutes. It's very difficult to get a snapshot, especially if we want to look at, is someone going to be safe when they're driving on their own? The person that drove me here today is not in the room?
Yeah.
Not in the room. He told me what I've heard a lot of, and that's as soon as you get your red Ps, you get in a car for the first time and they go, I'm alone. No one here is going to tell me how to get from A to B. And that's a big one. Navigation is something that countries all over the world, when they are teaching learner drivers, they forget to kind of scaffold that. We talked about scaffolding. They forget to scaffold that one to the learner, and then they become a red P played out. And yes, they might rely on GPS or that, but sometimes you just need some basic navigation skills as well. So that's my take on it. But yeah, I get competency-based licensing. It's a big thing and it's a big change. South Australia. Sorry?
South Australia changing their licensing.
Yeah. So I was like,
Hi, you mentioned earlier that 81% were female participants, and I was wondering, how did you find out what they failed for? Did you see a score sheet, or was it what they thought they heard, or their understanding of what the assessor said? And I also thought it was an interesting comment that they failed for being too cautious, because that's not something that I've heard before, ever.
so we got them to go through, in the survey, we had a checklist of items that they could check and say, these are the errors that I made on the test.
You saw their score sheet?
Not their actual score sheet, but what they are saying was on their score sheet.
Oh, their interpretation.
Yeah.
Because what they hear when they're reading my stress is very different to
Yeah.
what was actually said.
Absolutely.
Because I can stand next to a learner and what I'm hearing the assessor say and what they take away from it is miles apart.
Yes. I recently did my heavy vehicle license and experienced exactly the same thing, and it was the instructor that had to tell me, no, you actually passed.
Oh.
I heard, no, I did this error and that's a fail. So, yeah, I get that.
Yeah, look, I just was wondering whether there's any research which would show us that people who have particularly bad test anxiety might also be worse drivers in the future, or have no difference in the future. In other words, is it actually a useful indicator that you might not want to get rid of?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, so this is the first study that's been conducted in Australia that's even looked at driving test anxiety, which surprised me. And even though a lot of research that's done, it's like these are things that you expect are a given, that like test anxiety probably increases the number of errors. But we need the research, we need it there on paper to be able to make improvements. But I think that's a really good idea. And happy for any questions on young drivers, driver training, driver education, anything's fine.
You mentioned that they recalled making 1 or 2 errors on average, or 2 errors on average. In New South Wales, we have minor errors and major errors. Major errors are fail items.
Yeah.
Minor errors you can still pass.
Yes, yeah. So similar in Queensland.
So
And
were those errors major, minor, both?
yeah, so that data is in there and has been collected, but because we were asking P-platers, so we know that they've passed, and most of them had done the test only once or twice, so there were probably a lot that had passed on their first. So just thinking about that, I would say that most of them
Yeah,
are minor.
70% passed on the first attempt on
Yeah.
average, maybe.
Yeah. So probably most of them are minor errors, but yeah, we still need to work through that data.
Thanks, Natalie. I just wondered, with the research that you've conducted, has that been forwarded, or do you consult with Transport for New South Wales, for example, or Service New South Wales, so that they can put in or implement strategies to help with this anxiety?
So first step was presented this at the Australasian College of Road Safety's conference that they have, because governments and a lot of industry people are there. So I do know that I had Queensland Department of Transport and Main Roads in the room that heard these findings. We haven't published them as yet, but the conference abstract is available to anyone that goes into that website for the college. So yeah, but I'm happy for you to forward to any governments you would like.
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you. I noticed that one of the, you had the relaxation techniques. So
Yes,
I was
yes.
thinking, just because my wife's a psychologist, so she's always
Oh,
going
okay.
about this. And so like when our daughters are stressed or anxious, she does like box breathing
Yeah.
with them, and it's a really simple thing that you can do, and you can lower someone's anxiety literally within minutes
Yeah.
just through a simple breathing exercise. So like, I was just thinking that's something like you could teach a driving instructor how to
Exactly.
sort of get box breathing going, like
Yeah.
before the lesson, if you detect that they're anxious, and it's really simple, cost you nothing,
Yeah.
maybe a couple of minutes at a time.
Yeah.
But yeah,
and that-
I thought that's a simple solution, isn't it?
It is, and that's exactly the types of things that I don't want to roll out a 2 to 3 hour program with 9 different elements in it. So we're absolutely looking at what's easy and quick to implement, and also something, because I imagine, everyone here correct me if I'm wrong, I'm imagining things like this might be more difficult with the young males, even if they're feeling test anxiety, to get them to do things like breathing. They might see it as a bit, I'm not going to do that, or I don't understand that. So we'll be looking for things that aren't kind of in your face and obvious as well.
Okay.
So, yeah. And if anyone wants to be involved when we get it together and trial it, so we've had RACV in Victoria have approached us and want to trial it, but happy to do it in New South Wales as well.
So part of our Safe Drives course is that we do a breathing exercise with our learners, thank you. And what you've said is right. I say to my groups all the time, when I did my training, I thought this wouldn't work, but I actually do it myself, and it really does calm me down before I get into behind the wheel. And as you've said, create that visual for them to say, you know, whilst you're doing your shoes up or picking up your keys and walking to your car, do your 3 big deep breaths. By the time you get there, you've blown it all out. So
Yeah. And I think these are some of the things when you talked about should we just give it to learner drivers and get them to do it. I think they can misinterpret it, and especially the one about visualizing your success. So some of them will jump to the, I got my license, whereas it's not, it's the baby steps within doing the test. They're the aspects that they need to visualize. And so that's why I think teaching driving instructors to teach the learner drivers is a better way of doing it. All good? Thank you.